Africa's leaders weigh the conflicts in Libya and the Sahel. They're meeting in Ethiopia's capital for their annual summit and say they want to find out how they can curb violence and boost prosperity. But can the African Union play a bigger role in tackling the continent's security challenges? And has the bloc been fulfilling its mandate so far? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. The African Union is supposed to be a symbol of the continent's unity. It aims to empower Africans to solve their own problems. It has an ambitious plan to transform African states and establish security. But for many Africans, peace and prosperity are far from being a reality. The 55 leaders of the bloc are discussing how to tackle just that. They're gathered in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, for their annual summit. The two-day meeting is being held under the theme, Silencing the Guns. We'll break down the challenges they face in just a moment, but first, Malcolm Webb reports from Addis Ababa.
African heads of state have gathered here at the African Union's headquarters in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. And one of the key items on the agenda is the conflict in Libya. To date, the African Union hasn't played a very prominent role in the attempts to end Libya's conflict. Part of the reason is that it didn't engage much with the two warring factions until last month when the Libya conference was held in Berlin. Since then, the African Union's been raising its voice, but another key problem with the role of African governments in resolving this conflict is the role of powerful countries from outside Africa who are involved. Turkey has sent troops to support Libya's internationally recognized government in Tripoli. Meanwhile, Russia, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt have been accused of supporting the forces of General Khalifa Haftar. The conflict in the Sahel is also due to be discussed. Of course, it's connected. It escalated ever since Libya's civil war began nearly 9 years ago. Another thing to be discussed is the possibility of an African Union peacekeeping force in Libya. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, speaking here, talked about the need for more African peacekeeping missions and for missions with stronger mandates, peace enforcement missions, as he put it, but he also warned that it would be very difficult to bring peace to Libya if the meddling of other outside powers doesn't stop. Malcolm Webb for Inside Story.
Well, here's a look at some of the major challenges that will be addressed, hopefully, at the summit. High on the agenda, as we heard, is how to stop the conflicts in Libya and Mali and the growing instability in the Sahel region. The United Nations is calling on African Union leaders to play a greater role there. Then there's poverty. Africa, considered the poorest continent on Earth, almost every second person living in sub-Saharan Africa lives below the poverty line. Climate change is also a huge challenge. The UN says that warmer seas have led to more cyclones, generating the perfect breeding ground for locusts. Let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. Here in Doha with us is Afyari Elmi, Professor of International Relations at Qatar University. From Cape Town, we're joined by Sanusha Naidu, a Senior Research Fellow at Institute for Global Dialogue, a South African think tank. And from Birmingham in the UK, Aliou Moussa, who's an independent researcher on conflict studies in Africa. Welcome to Inside Story, all of you. Thanks for being with us. Sanusha, let's start with you. The theme then of this year's summit, Silencing the Guns. Now, the AU doesn't have a particularly good record on delivering on its summit themes. What can we expect from this summit? What would you want to see come out of it?
Well, I think, Adrian, the first thing is the theme itself. I think it's a very tall order in terms of the milestone set by the AU leaders in terms of silencing of the guns. We know that this is a bit of a stretch. We know that conflict and instability has continued to characterize the conflict, the continent, and it remains a difficult task in terms of how you put the different drivers and factors together and you develop cohesive policies and interventions around this. I think one of the things that's very important to note as well is that South Africa is taking over the chair of the AU. And of course, a few weeks ago, President Ramaphosa had set out what he called some of the key areas that South Africa would pursue in conjunction with the AU leadership, as well as in terms of where they would like to see the continent going in terms of Agenda 2063. I think some of it includes gender empowerment, looking at the economic integration of the continent, but more importantly, I think also trying to ensure that you have more kind of cohesiveness with regard to African intervention with regard to security and peace and stability. Now, I think that has been some of the key drawbacks for the continent. And of course, questioning around issues with regard to a cohesive climate change policy, as you mentioned, as we saw in the insert. But more importantly, I think, is how do you develop a kind of broad continental consensus? And I think that, for me, is what I would like to see more and more in terms of what's happening in the continent today, is you have 5 regional economic communities which need to play a much bigger, much more constructive and strategic role in terms of the broad policies that the AU wants to achieve, whether it's in developing its peace and its African peacekeeping force, whether it's around the early warning systems with regard to climate change, and of course in terms of stability, whether it's intra conflict, the interstate conflict that's taking place. So in a sense, I think we're looking at a continent that's also kind of trying to find itself with a mixed record in terms of its achievements.
I want to explore a little more later in our discussion, South Africa taking the chair of the African Union and what difference that will make to the grouping. But staying with the theme for a moment, Aliou, what was it, back in 2013, the African Union set out its aspiration to end war and prevent genocide by the year 2020. Here we are, 7 years on. Why hasn't that aspiration been met?
Well, the key thing is this is 7 years down since 2013, when we went into Mali, particularly to end the conflict in Mali. I remember then the French forces were in Mali to end the crisis there. I remember then Boko Haram wasn't quite as much as it was then. Today, I agree, the government of President Buhari said in 2016, then after 1 year after it came to power, that it had downgraded Boko Haram. But as of 2019, some months ago, Boko Haram re-emerged. And 2020 today, Boko Haram is still fighting. The whole of the Sahel is decimated. Boko Haram, the Al-Qaeda in Islamic in West Africa is still fighting. More people are dying. So it appears we have spent 7 years fighting these criminals, 7 years fighting these terrorists, but it appears that we haven't done much. It seems we have made a lot of moves, but it appears we're still in the same position. It appears we haven't achieved much. It means we have to replan, we have to re-strategize. It means we need to reassess ourselves and ask ourselves, why have we not achieved so much, even though we seem to have made so much movement of our body? What have we actually achieved? Yeah. So it means there is so much to be done.
Afiare, Professor, there have been some limited successes in places like Sudan and the Central African Republic, for example. But why do African leaders seem wary of greater engagement in conflict resolution? The International Crisis Group issued a briefing on this summit and said that despite the theme silencing the guns, the summit agenda suggests that discussions on peace and security won't actually take centre stage. Why is that? Are African leaders genuinely committed to collective peacekeeping?
Well, thank you. Actually, there are a number of issues with this. As far as I know, African Union as an organization and the African states in general understand the enormous challenges they are facing on the security front, but there is actually a gap between the will and the capacity. The capacity to deliver on these issues is really limited. When you look at, for instance, countries where African Union forces are present, I mean, particularly like the case of Somalia, for instance, they've been keeping the Somali government in a more or less like life support rather than just delivering any tangible successes in consolidating the peace or actually moving beyond certain areas. So when you look at it, there are, I mean, structural limitations that the continent and its organization face. Of course, I agree with my colleagues here that the continental organization made a real progress since when it used to be called, they used to call dictator's club, and now we have a number of democracies. The democratization aspect is actually moving fine, even though there are mixed records here and there. The continent is actually raising its profile at the global level. There are a number of, progresses in certain areas, but when it comes to security, particularly intra-state security and violent extremism, I think their role was more or less like, very, very limited.
Sanusha, you talked about South Africa taking the chair of the African Union this year. I think we can all agree that South Africa has punched well below its weight for at least the last decade on the international stage. But now that it holds the AU chair, it's got a seat on the UN Security Council currently. Is all of that about to change? What sort of leadership should South Africa be providing to the AU, and what sort of clout will Ramaphosa have with other African leaders?
Just to pick up on the last point, and I'll get to the South African chairing of the AU, I think the other challenge in the continent is not just the political will, but the ability to actually hold errant leaders accountable. And I think that's also part of the challenge in terms of the financial resources and whether or not we are willing, African leaders are willing to put the investment into the kind of peace and security architecture it needs. And I think that also speaks to the kinds of external influence and geopolitical interests that we see now in the Sahel and in North Africa.
Right.
And therefore, coming to South Africa,
No, hang on. Sanusha, before we get to South Africa, then let me pick you up on that point. Can the AU afford to assume greater responsibility for conflict management? And if it can't pay, who should pay? In September, the African Union paused negotiations with the UN over co-funding of peace operations. So what happens next? Where do they go from there?
Well, that's the big question, Adrian, because right now we're sitting in a bit of a cul-de-sac. We're sitting in limbo here because there was a proposal on the table by the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, talking about a percentage of a kind of a tax or a kind of a revenue stream that will be able to make African countries or the AU self-sufficient. But here's the challenge. We sit with an organization like the AU, which is a monolithic organization in terms of sovereignty with regard to statehood. It's also the question of big countries versus small countries. The bigger countries, are they willing to support the smaller countries, wanting to have the same level of voice? So we're sitting in a conundrum at the moment. And I think this is the challenge for South Africa, is to what extent after a decade of having to rebuild its social capital in the continent, it will have to start pushing on some of these proposals, in spite of the fact that I think South Africa also has to now go back to the AU and try and re-establish its credibility, its credentials, etc., because it's kind of been out on the periphery on some of these issues. I know President Ramaphosa has made a very interesting statement talking about the alignment between the UN and the AU, etc. It was very key in terms of bringing Resolution 2063, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, when it sat the last time on the UN Security Council. But I think the big challenge here is South Africa's need to bring a consensus back to the table. And right now we're finding that if you're looking at Africa, somehow the North African region is completely out of that strategic ambit in terms of what needs to happen and what needs to go ahead in terms of a consensus, because we're not seeing that. And of course, the external role of actors like Turkey, Russia, even the Western powers, etc., have actually had constructed their architecture around what their interests are within Libya and in particular around the North African Sahel region.
Aliou, to what extent has the AU failed on Libya? It's effectively been sidelined as far as Libya and that conflict spillover into the Sahel are concerned. It's representative, a last-minute addition to the Berlin conference. Can the AU provide any solution to the conflict in Libya, or is it now too late for it to get involved? Has that moment passed?
Well, from the beginning, AU was sidelined, like you rightly mentioned, because in the first place, when the Western world were getting involved in the Libyan conflict, they did not actually involve AU. All they were concerned about was to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi. Even President Obama said he made a mistake because he planned getting into Libya to get rid of Gaddafi without planning about the aftermath of al-Gaddafi's ouster. So in the end, AU was not involved in getting rid of him. Neither was AU involved in planning about his aftermath. So up until now, the whole of the planning is always done outside of Africa. Imagine even the peace meetings that were being held outside of Africa. So up until now, everything that is being done is being outside Africa without really getting AU involved. What needs to be done now is to get AU involved actively in finding African solution to the Libyan crisis. Because if we're looking for an African answer, AU has to be in the forefront of getting that solution done. Otherwise, no solution will ever be found regarding the problem in Libya, and that is why it is deadlocked. And regarding the way the problem of Libya has affected other African countries, particularly Nigeria, we know arms have moved from Libya to other places, especially the Sahel and the Chad Basin. We know machineries have also moved from Libya to Nigeria specifically. So these are things AU should have thought of how to stop them from moving around and causing conflict in other parts of the continent. So these are things we should be planning about and not just being at the sideline watching and allowing them to get all over the continent.
Professor Elmi, will all of that change? Will the AU position now change? Will it have a greater role to play, do you think, in Libya with South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa at the chair of the organisation, taking over from Egypt's president, who let's face it, was partisan as far as Libya is concerned?
Well, I really wish that would be the case. But if you just look at things, it shows how weak the organization is. And the irony here is that Gaddafi and Libya spent a lot of money in building the AU as it is at the moment. And all of these just didn't pay anything back when it comes to just contributing to the conflict resolution to Libya. And even what they are offering at the moment at the AU is that Africans will just offer the boots. The mandate and the money will be just coming from the West or outside the region. And if that's the case, then I don't think it will just add much. It just becomes more like an employment opportunity for some. And this shouldn't be actually the role that the continental organization is advocating. I haven't seen any actual, I would say, initiative, elaborative initiative that addresses or aside this rhetoric of African problems, African solutions for African problems, I didn't see anything, at least in the public, where African Union is proposing achievable goals within the Libyan context, other than just sending more troops there.
Sanusha, we've got about 6 minutes left, and I've got so many questions I want to ask, so I need a reasonably concise answer from you here. Let's get back to the question I asked you earlier about South Africa's leadership of the EU this year, with Cyril Ramaphosa taking the chair, and what sort of clout it will have with other EU leaders.
I think, Cyril has been building up his foreign policy capital in terms of the investment portfolio and trying to attract investment. So he's trying to align that in terms of having more of a continental outreach. He talks about this in the context of the need for economic integration and how important it is to align that investment to the AU. But I also think that it's going to be an important sell for him to make in terms of distinguishing what is a South African-centric approach and what is an African-centric approach. And I think if he ties it to the fact that without stability in the continent, you can't have economic development, and you can't actually deal with peace, stability, and security in terms of sorting out the economic dimensions around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, empowering women, youth employment, etc. I think those are some of the issues he's going to put forward. But I think what he needs to do is take a mandate from Africa as the chair of the AU to those meetings, whether it's in the G20, in the UN, and so forth.
Aliou, briefly, what should the AU be doing about African leaders changing the rules to hold on to power and the violence that fuels? I mean, the AU has, it strongly condemns and ostracizes those who carry out military coups, and yet it remains largely silent on people who circumvent term limits. I mean, why is that?
Well, I think the key problem is that Africa hasn't got a military force of its own, military power of its own, whereby it can forcibly remove any leader that decides not to go. For instance, the only time something really practical was almost done was in the case of former President Yahya Jammeh of Gambia, when he refused to hand over power to someone who won in an election that was adjudged to be free and fair. Then at the time, African Union was putting together a force that would forcibly remove him because he did not want to go. But that was just a one-off case. Perhaps if African Union has got a kind of force that will be put on a standby just in case there was any African leader that would sit tight and refuse to go, then there will be that kind of threat or clear threat to him that if you don't want to go, then we get rid of you. Then probably most African leaders will know that we cannot stay beyond the legal time for us to stay in power. Then they would know that, yes, we cannot stay forever in power. Otherwise, people like Paul Biya have no reason to stay up to the time they are staying in power now. And that is why we're having the kind of problems we are having. They have overstayed in power. They have stayed beyond their relevance. And that is why we're having the kind of problems we're having of so many people rising up and saying that we don't want any more of you.
Professor Afiare, what are the chances of us seeing that sort of African force in the near future? I mean, the prospects of seeing, for instance, an African Union force on the ground in Libya?
Well, I think a lot depends on how the other parts of the world, particularly the West, is willing to contribute the financial and the mandate aspect of it. If they do, then possibly the African Union or African countries are able to just provide the troops that are needed. So from that point of view, I think there is a possibility. Whether that arrangement is effective or not, I think I would say it's not. And it has not been effective in Somalia and elsewhere. And I don't expect that will be the case, because whenever there is a shortage or the funding dries up or whatever, or the mandate is not renewed in time, then all of things just fall apart. And that is the problem we have been facing. With respect to the Ramaphosa and what he can do, I think some credibility is at least injected, I would say, with South African presidents. And I hope even though, I mean, for the last 4 or 5 years, the rotation of power, the number of countries that have engaged increased. That doesn't mean democratization has been on the rise. There are, within whether it's Abiy Ahmed or others who just came within the party, that doesn't mean that there is a democratization process is just going forward. But there is hopeful, I would say, continent. We're talking about Africa, which is youthful, 70% or more of the people are under 35, with large number of, large resources, a big continent. All of these things actually, and big interest that's coming from overseas.
Okay.
I think there is a hopeful future, but a lot, I would say, that are in the way. And with the African leaders, let's hope that they are able to just achieve some.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for being with us. Afiare Elmi, Sanusha Naidu, and Aliou Musa in the UK. And as always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see this programme anytime just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion on the AU, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.